Long before villages, tools of metal, or written language existed, early humans faced winters that were long, dark, and extremely dangerous. These winters were not mild seasons of cold, but months of freezing winds, deep snow, and deadly ice storms that could kill an unprepared person in a single night. Cavemen did not understand weather patterns the way modern humans do, but through experience, loss, and careful observation, they learned that survival depended on shelter more than strength. Open land offered food during warmer months, but in winter became a place of exposure and death. Wind stripped heat from the body, snow buried tracks and tools, and predators grew more aggressive as food became scarce. Because of this, cavemen slowly began to search for hidden places that could protect them from the worst of winter. They noticed that caves stayed warmer than the open air, that earth blocked the wind, and that rock walls did not freeze as quickly as bare skin. Over many generations, these observations formed the foundation of shelter, building knowledge. Hidden shelters were not built for comfort or beauty. They were built to survive quietly. The goal was to stay unseen, retain body heat, and avoid attracting predators or rival groups. Cavemen learned that shelters placed too close to open valleys were exposed to wind, while shelters placed too high were colder and harder to reach during snowstorms. Slowly, they began choosing locations near rock faces, hillsides, and forest edges where snow gathered less and wind was broken naturally. These shelters blended into the landscape, often invisible from a distance. Survival during winter depended on preparation long before the cold arrived, and those who failed to plan did not live long enough to teach the next generation. Once a suitable location was chosen, cavemen focused on shaping the shelter in a way that would trap warmth while remaining hidden from both animals and enemies. Natural caves were preferred, but they were rare and often already occupied by predators. When caves were unavailable, cavemen carved shallow chambers into hillsides using stone tools and patience. These shelters were not large, because large spaces lost heat quickly. Instead, they were narrow, low, and sometimes barely tall enough to sit upright. The entrance was kept small to reduce wind exposure and prevent snow from blowing inside. Often, the doorway faced away from prevailing winds, a detail learned through repeated winters of trial and error. Inside, walls were smooth and sometimes lined with packed earth, clay or animal hides to block cold air seeping through cracks. Floors were layered with dry grass, moss, and fur to insulate bodies from frozen ground. Fire was used sparingly, as smoke could reveal the shelter's location. Small fire pits were dug near entrances, so smoke could escape unnoticed. Cavemen understood that staying hidden was as important as staying warm. A visible shelter could attract predators or rival groups desperate for resources. For this reason, shelters were camouflaged using branches, dirt, and snow. Over time, snow itself became part of the disguise, forming a natural insulation layer. These shelters were silent, dark, and cramped, but they served their purpose. They allowed families to endure nights that would otherwise be fatal. The design was simple, but every element served a function learned through harsh experience. Food storage was another critical factor in winter survival, and hidden shelters were often built near natural storage areas rather than hunting grounds. Cavemen learned that winter was not a time for frequent hunting, but for endurance and careful rationing. Before winter began, meat was dried, smoked, or frozen naturally in cold ground pits. These storage pits were hidden near shelters, sometimes sealed with stone and earth to keep animals away. Shelters were placed close enough to these food stores to reduce exposure during storms, but far enough to avoid attracting scavengers directly to living spaces. Water was gathered from nearby sources and sometimes stored as ice inside shaded pits. Inside the shelter, movement was kept minimal to conserve energy. Cavemen understood that unnecessary motion increased hunger and heat loss. Groups stayed close together, sharing warmth and limiting activity. Stories were not told for entertainment, but to keep children calm and awake during dangerous nights. These shelters became places of waiting rather than living. Days passed slowly as wind howled outside and snow buried the land. Survival depended on patience, silence, and discipline. Those who followed shelter rules lived longer. Those who ignored them risked death for the entire group. Over generations, shelter knowledge became tradition, passed down through demonstration rather than words. Children watched adults reinforce walls, seal entrances, and prepare bedding. These lessons were remembered not because they were interesting, but because forgetting them meant death. In this way, hidden shelters became one of the most important survival technologies of early humans, allowing them to endure winters that would otherwise erase them from history. As winters grew colder over centuries, cavemen refined their shelter-building techniques by closely observing which designs failed and which endured. Shelters that collapsed under snow were abandoned, while those that remained intact were studied and copied. One of the most important lessons learned was the strength of rounded and sloped structures. Flat roofs trapped snow and ice, increasing weight until collapse was inevitable. To solve this, cavemen began shaping shelter roofs with gentle curves, allowing snow to slide off naturally. Earth was packed tightly over wooden frames made from branches and animal bones, creating a dense layer that blocked wind and retained heat. This method required careful balance, as too much weight could crush the structure, while too little insulation allowed cold air to penetrate. Over time, cavemen learned how much earth was enough by feel rather than measurement. These shelters were not built quickly. Construction often took weeks, done gradually before winter arrived. Families worked together, reinforcing walls and repairing cracks long before snow fell. Once winter began, repairs became dangerous and difficult. The shelter itself became a barrier between life and death. Inside, darkness was constant, as openings were minimized to prevent heat loss. Cavemen adapted to this by slowing their daily rhythms. Sleeping periods became longer, and waking hours were short and quiet. The shelter was not a place of activity, but a place of endurance. Sound was kept low to avoid attracting predators that prowled the frozen landscape. Even breathing felt heavy in the cold air, and bodies huddled together for warmth. These shelters were not abandoned at the end of winter, but carefully maintained year after year, becoming reliable sanctuaries against recurring cold. Hidden shelters also played a crucial role in protecting cavemen from predators during winter, when animals became more aggressive and desperate. Large predators such as wolves, cave lions, and bears searched tirelessly for food, often following human scent trails. Cavemen learned to reduce their presence by choosing shelter locations away from animal paths and watering areas. Entrances were sometimes elevated slightly above ground level to prevent predators from easily detecting or accessing them. Fires were kept small and controlled, often allowed to burn only during the coldest hours of the night. Smoke was carefully vented through narrow cracks or natural rock fissures, dispersing before it could be seen. Waste was never left near shelters, as it attracted animals. Everything that could produce scent was buried far away or sealed beneath frozen ground. These practices were not based on superstition, but on repeated survival outcomes. Groups that ignored scent control often disappeared during harsh winters. Shelters also acted as sound barriers. Thick earth walls muffled noise, preventing coughing, movement, or whispered speech from carrying outside. Children were taught to remain still and quiet for long periods. Winter survival demanded discipline even from young. In extreme cold, predators could hear movement from great distances. Cavemen understood this danger instinctively. The shelter became a place of stillness, where patience mattered more than strength. This discipline allowed small groups to survive unnoticed, while larger animals passed nearby, unaware of the hidden human presence beneath the snow-covered earth. Paragraph 6. Over generations, hidden shelters evolved into seasonal knowledge rather than permanent homes. Cavemen did not live in one place year-round. Instead, they migrated with food sources and returned to known shelter sites before winter began. These sites were remembered through landmarks rather than maps. Certain rock formations, trees, or river bends marked the locations of reliable shelters. Elders guided groups back to these places each year, reinforcing traditions of preparation and caution. Shelters were reopened carefully, inspected for damage, and repaired before use. Snowmelt and animals could weaken structures during warmer months. Repairing shelters became a ritual of survival, signaling the transition from movement to stillness. Inside, tools were arranged deliberately to minimize motion. Everything had a place to avoid unnecessary searching in darkness. The interior of a winter shelter was organized for efficiency rather than comfort. Heat was concentrated near sleeping areas, and cold zones near entrances were avoided. Cavemen learned to block drafts using hides and pack grass, adjusting insulation as temperatures changed. These adjustments were subtle but critical. A small gap could mean frostbite or death during extreme cold. Through quiet repetition, cavemen perfected these methods. The shelters themselves rarely changed in appearance, but the knowledge behind them grew deeper. Survival became less about reacting to winter and more about anticipating it. Hidden shelters allowed cavemen to wait out the season rather than fight it. In the stillness, humanity endured. Winter shelters were not only physical structures, but psychological refuges that helped cavemen endure long periods of isolation and darkness. Once sealed inside for the season, time lost its normal meaning. Days blended together, as light rarely entered the shelter. Cavemen adapted by developing strict routines that reduced stress and panic. Sleeping, eating, and tending small fires happened at consistent times, even when the sun could not be seen. This predictability helped prevent fear, which could lead to reckless behavior. The shelter's confined space forced close social proximity, which sometimes caused tension. To manage this, elders enforced quiet behavior and minimal movement. Conflict during winter could weaken the group, waste energy, and increase risk. Children were taught early that winter shelters required obedience and patience. These lessons were learned through observation rather than instruction. The shelter became a place where emotional control was as important as physical warmth. Cavemen who panicked or grew restless risked exposing shelter or consuming supplies too quickly. Over generations, groups that maintained discipline survived longer and passed on their methods. The shelter, therefore, shaped not only survival strategies but early social behavior. Stillness, cooperation, and restraint became winter traits. These behaviors carried into other aspects of life, influencing how groups hunted, migrated, and interacted. The hidden shelter acted as a training ground for endurance, teaching early humans that survival sometimes meant waiting rather than acting. Another key feature of winter shelters was their relationship with the surrounding landscape. Cavemen did not alter the environment aggressively, but adapted to it subtly. Trees were not cut excessively, as deforestation increased wind exposure. Instead, branches were taken selectively, leaving the natural windbreak intact. Snowdrifts were allowed to form naturally over shelters, increasing insulation. In some cases, cavemen intentionally encouraged snow buildup by placing low barriers nearby. This technique created an insulating layer that stabilized interior temperatures. The shelter itself became part of the terrain, almost indistinguishable from its surroundings. From a distance, nothing suggested human presence. This invisibility reduced the chance of discovery by predators or rival groups. Cavemen understood that winter was a time to disappear rather than dominate. The landscape protected those who respected it. Rivers, forests, and hills were not obstacles but shields. Shelters were positioned to take advantage of natural heat retention, such as south-facing slopes that absorbed weak winter sunlight. These decisions were not theoretical but experiential. Groups that chose poor locations suffered losses and did not repeat those mistakes. Over time, shelter placement became a form of environmental knowledge passed through generations. Survival was no longer random, but guided by accumulated understanding of land and climate. As winters ended, shelters were not immediately abandoned. Cavemen remained cautious, knowing that sudden storms could return. Shelters were gradually reopened, allowing fresh air and light to enter slowly. Supplies were assessed carefully to ensure nothing was wasted. Any remaining food was preserved or shared. Damage was noted and repaired for the next season. These post-winter rituals were just as important as preparation. They ensured that shelters remained usable year after year. Cavemen did not see shelters as temporary solutions, but as recurring lifelines. Even during warmer months, shelters were remembered and respected. Children were shown their locations and taught how they were built. These lessons were practical rather than ceremonial. Memory ensured survival. Without written records, repetition was essential. The shelter stood as silent evidence of past winters endured. Its continued existence reassured groups that future winters could also be survived. In this way, shelters connected generations, linking past experience to future hope. Post-winter prehistoric shelter, cavemen carefully reopening entrance, letting in soft light and fresh air, inspecting and repairing walls, organizing remaining food, muted spring-to-winter tones, cinematic focus on continuity, memory, and preparation for future survival. As time passed, the knowledge of winter shelters became deeply embedded in caveman culture. Even though it was never spoken of as tradition, there were no ceremonies or celebrations attached to shelter building. It was treated as a necessary task, approached with seriousness and quiet focus. Younger members of the group learned by watching elders work slowly and methodically. They observed how soil was packed, how branches were angled, and how entrances were narrowed. Mistakes were rarely corrected verbally. Instead, consequences taught the lesson. A poorly sealed shelter resulted in cold drafts, frostbitten skin, or sickness. These outcomes reinforced correct behavior without explanation. Cavemen remember what worked because failure was costly. Over generations, shelter building techniques became refined without conscious innovation. Each generation added small improvements based on experience. These changes were subtle but important. Better insulation, improved drainage, and stronger support frames increased survival rates. Shelters became more reliable, even as winters remained harsh. This slow accumulation of practical knowledge allowed early humans to survive climates that would otherwise have been uninhabitable. Drainage was another crucial aspect of winter shelter design that cavemen learned through repeated hardship. Melting snow could seep into shelters, turning floors into frozen mud and increasing the risk of illness. To prevent this, shelters were often built slightly above surrounding ground level or with shallow channels dug to redirect water away. Floors were layered carefully to keep moisture from reaching sleeping areas. Stones were placed beneath bedding to elevate bodies and allow air circulation. These details required planning and foresight, qualities developed through long experience rather than instinct alone. Cavemen also learned to avoid building shelters near flood-prone areas, even if those locations seemed protected. A shelter that flooded during thaw could become deadly overnight if temperatures dropped again. These lessons reinforce the importance of patience in choosing shelter locations. Safety was prioritized over convenience. A longer walk to secure shelter was preferable to risk. Through these decisions, cavemen demonstrated an early understanding of environmental dynamics, even without formal knowledge. Prehistoric winter shelter built slightly above ground with shallow drainage channels, layered floor with stones beneath bedding for air circulation, snow melting outside. Cavemen arranging insulation carefully, muted winter tones, cinematic focus on foresight, moisture control, and survival through planning. Prehistoric winter shelter built slightly above ground with shallow drainage channels, layered floor with stones beneath bedding for air circulation, snow melting outside. Cavemen arranging insulation carefully, muted winter tones, cinematic focus on foresight, moisture control, and survival through planning. Hidden winter shelters may appear simple when viewed through a modern lens, but their importance cannot be overstated. They were not built with comfort in mind, nor were they designed to last forever. They were built to serve one purpose: survival. Through careful observation, restraint, and repetition, cavemen created spaces that allowed them to endure some of the harshest conditions on Earth. These shelters reflect an early understanding of nature's power and humanity's limitations. Cavemen did not attempt to reshape the world to suit themselves. Instead, they adapted quietly, using the land as it was. In doing so, they ensured their survival through countless winters. The legacy of these shelters lives on in modern architecture, seasonal planning, and human resilience. In the stillness of hidden shelters, humanity learned how to survive by doing very little at all.